allowed to be seen by women. It was a period of quietude, a kind of spiritual preparation for the trials of manhood that lay ahead. On the day of our re-emergence, we went down to the river early in the morning to wash away the white ochre in the waters of the Mdish. Once we were clean and dry, we were coated in red ochre. The tradition was that one should sleep with a woman, who later may become one's wife, and she rubs off the pigment with her body. In my case, however, the ochre was removed with a mixture of fat and lard. At the end of our seclusion, the lodges and all their contents were burned, destroying our last links to childhood, and a great ceremony was held to welcome us as men to society. Our families, friends, and local chiefs gathered for speeches, songs, and gift-giving. I was given to heifers and for sheep, and felt far richer than I ever had before. I who had never owned anything suddenly possessed property. It was a heady feeling, even though my gifts were paltry next to those of Justice, who inherited an entire herd. I was not jealous of Justice's gifts. He was the son of a king, I was merely destined to be a counselor to a king. I felt strong and proud that day. I remember walking differently on that day, straighter, taller, firmer. I was hopeful, and thinking that I might someday have wealth, property, and status. The main speaker of the day was Chief Maligtali, the son of Dalandaibo, and after listening to him, my gaily colored dreams suddenly darkened. He began conventionally, remarking on how fine it was that we were continuing a tradition that had been going on for as long as anyone could remember. Then he turned to us and his tone suddenly changed. "There sit our sons," he said, "young, healthy, and handsome, the flower of the Xhosa tribe, the pride of our nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promises them manhood, but I am here to tell you that it is an empty, illusory promise, a promise that can never be fulfilled. For we Xhosas, and all black South Africans, are a conquered people. We are slaves in our own country. We are tenants on our own soil. We have no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our birth. They will go to cities where they will live in shacks and drink cheap alcohol, all because we have no land to give them where they could prosper and multiply. They will cough their lungs out deep in the bowels of the white man's mines, destroying their health, never seeing the sun, so that the white man can live a life of unequaled prosperity. Among these young men are chiefs who will never rule because we have no power to govern ourselves, soldiers who will never fight for we have no weapons to fight with, scholars who will never teach because we have no place for them to study. The abilities, the intelligence, the promise of these young men will be squandered in their attempt to eke out a living doing the simplest, most mindless chores for the white man. These gifts today are not, for we cannot give them the greatest gift of all, which is freedom and independence. I well note that Gamada is all-seeing and never sleeps, but I have a suspicion that Gamada may in fact be dozing. If this is the case, the sooner I die the better, because then I can meet him and shake him awake and tell him that the children of Ngubengcuka, the flower of the Xhosa nation, are dying. The audience had become more and more quiet as Chief Maligtali spoke and, I think, more and more angry. No one wanted to hear the words that he spoke that day. I know that I myself did not want to hear them. I was cross rather than aroused by the chief's remarks, dismissing his words as the abusive comments of an ignorant man who was unable to appreciate the value of the education and benefits that the white man had brought to our country. At the time, I looked on the white man not as an oppressor but as a benefactor, and I thought the chief was enormously ungrateful. This upstart chief was ruining my day, spoiling the proud feeling with wrong-headed remarks. But without exactly understanding why, his words soon began to work in me. He had planted a seed, and though I left that seed lie dormant for long season, it eventually began to grow. Later, I realized that the ignorant man that day was not the chief but myself. After the ceremony, I walked back to the river and watched it meander on its way to where, many miles distant, it emptied into the Indian Ocean. I had never crossed that river, and I knew little or nothing of the world beyond it, the world that beckoned me that day. It was almost sunset and I hurried on to where our seclusion lodges had been. Though it was forbidden to look back while the lodges were burning, I could not resist. When I reached the area, all that remained were two pyramids of ashes by a large mimosa tree. In these ash heaps lay a lost and delightful world, the world of my childhood, the world of sweet and irresponsible days at Kunu and Mkhekeresweni. Now I was a man, and I would never again play thin tea, or steal maize, or drink milk from a cow's udder. I was already in mourning for my own youth. Looking back, I know that I was not a man that day and would not truly become one for many years. 5. Unlike most of the others with whom I had been at circumcision school, I was not destined to work in the gold mines on the reef. The regent had often told me, "It is not for you to spend your life mining the white man's gold, never knowing how to write your name." My destiny was to become a counselor to Sabadat, and for that I had to be educated. I returned to Mkhekherswani after the ceremony, but not for very long, for I was about to cross the Mbish River for the first time on my way to Clarklebury Boarding Institute in the district of Nkabo. I was again leaving home, but I was eager to see how I would fare in the wider world. The regent himself drove me to Nkabo in his majestic Ford V8. Before leaving, he had organized a celebration for my having passed Standard V and been admitted to Clarklebury. The sheep was slaughtered and there was dancing and singing. It was the first celebration that I had ever had in my own honor, and I greatly enjoyed it. The regent gave me my first pair of boots, a sign of manhood, and that night I polished them anew, even though they were already shiny. Founded in 1825, Clarklebury Institute was located on the site of one of the oldest Wesleyan missions in the Transcape. At the time, Clarklebury was the highest institution of learning for Africans in the Midland. The regent himself had attended Clarklebury, and Justice had followed him there. It was both a secondary school and a teacher training college, but it also offered courses in more practical disciplines, such as carpentry, tailoring, and tinsmithing. During the trip, the regent advised me on my behavior and my future. He urged me to behave in a way that brought only respect to Sabadat and to himself, and I assured him that I would. He then briefed me on the Reverend C. Harris, the governor of the school. Reverend Harris, he explained, was unique. He was a white Bambu, a white man who in his heart loved and understood the Bambu people. The regent said when Sabadat was older, he would entrust the future king to Reverend Harris, who would train him as both a Christian and a traditional ruler. He said that I must learn from Reverend Harris because I was destined to guide the leader that Reverend Harris was to mold. At Mkhekherswani I had met many white traders and government officials, including magistrates and police officers. These were men of high standing and the regent received them courteously, but not obsequiously. He treated them on equal terms, as they did him. At times, I even saw him upbraid them, though this was extremely rare. I had very little experience in dealing directly with whites. The regent never told me how to behave, and I observed him and followed his example. In talking about Reverend Harris, however, the regent, for the first time, gave me a lecture on how I was to conduct myself. He said I must afford the Reverend the same respect and obedience that I gave to him. Clarklebury was far grander even than Mkhekherswani. The school itself consisted of a cluster of 24 or so graceful, colonial-style buildings, which included individual homes as well as dormitories, the library, and various instructional halls. It was the first place I lived that was Western, not African, and I felt I was entering a new world whose rules were not yet clear to me. We were taken into Reverend Harris's study, where the regent introduced me and I stood to shake his hand, the first time I had ever shaken hands with a white man. Reverend Harris was warm and friendly, and treated the regent with great deference. The regent explained that I was being groomed to be a counselor to the king and that he hoped the Reverend would take a special interest in me. The Reverend nodded, adding that Clarklebury students were required to do manual labor after school hours, and he would arrange for me to work in his garden. At the end of the interview, the regent bade me goodbye and handed me a pound note for pocket money, the largest amount of money I had ever possessed. I bade him farewell and promised that I would not disappoint him. Clarklebury was a Bambu college, founded on land given by the great Bambu king Ngu Bentuka. As a descendant of Ngu Bentuka, I presumed that I would be accorded the same deference at Clarklebury that I had come to expect in Mkhekherswani. But I was painfully mistaken, for I was treated no differently than everyone else. No one knew or even cared that I was a descendant of the illustrious Ngu Bentuka. The boarding master received me without a blowing of trumpets and my fellow students did not bow and scrape before me. At Clarklebury, plenty of the boys had distinguished lineages, and I was no longer unique. This was an important lesson, for I suspect I was a bit stuck up in those days. I quickly realized that I had to make my way on the basis of my ability, not my heritage. Most of my classmates could outrun me on the playing field and outthink me in the classroom, and I had a good deal of catching up to do. Classes commenced the following morning, and along with my fellow students I climbed the steps to the first floor where the classrooms were located. The room itself had a beautifully polished wooden floor. On this first day of classes I was clad in my new boots. I had never worn boots before of any kind, and that first day, I walked like a newly shod horse. I made a terrible racket walking up the steps and almost slipped several times. As I clomped into the classroom, my boots crashing on that shiny wooden floor, I noticed two female students in the first row were watching my lame performance with great amusement. The prettier of the two leaned over to her friend and said loud enough for all to hear, "A country boy is not used to wearing shoes," at which her friend laughed. I was blind with fury and embarrassment. Her name was Madhana and she was a bit of a smart aleck. That day I vowed never to talk to her. But as my mortification wore off and I became more adept at walking with boots, I also got to know her, and she was to become my greatest friend at Clarklebury. She was my first true female friend, a woman I met on equal terms with whom I could confide and share secrets. In many ways, she was the model for all my subsequent friendships with women, for with women I found I could let my hair down and confess to weaknesses and fears I would never reveal to another man. I soon adapted myself to a life at Clarklebury. I participated in sports and games as often as I could, but my performances were no more than mediocre. I played for the love of sport, not the glory, for I received none. We played lawn tennis with homemade wooden rackets and soccer with bare feet on a field of dust. For the first time, I was taught by teachers who had themselves been properly educated. Several of them held university degrees, which was extremely rare. One day, I was studying with Madhana, and I confided to her my fear that I might not pass my exams in English and history at the end of the year. She told me not to worry because our teacher, Gertrude Labathick, was the first African woman to obtain the BA. "She is too clever to let us fail," Madhana said. I had not yet learned to feign knowledge that I did not possess, and as I had only a vague idea what a BA was, I questioned Madhana. "Oh, yes, of course," she answered. "The BA is a very long and difficult book." I did not doubt her. Another African teacher with a Bachelor of Arts degree was Ben Malasila. We admired him not only because of his academic achievement, but because he was not intimidated by Reverend Harris. Even the white faculty behaved in a servile manner to Reverend Harris, but Mr. Malasila would walk into the Reverend's office without fear, and sometimes would even fail to remove his hat. He met the Reverend on equal terms, disagreeing with him where others simply assented. Though I respected Reverend Harris, I admired the fact that Mr. Malasila would not be cowed by him. In those days, a black man with a BA was expected to scrape before a white man with a grade school education. No matter how high a black man advanced, he was still considered inferior to the lowest white man. Reverend Harris ran Clarklebury with an iron hand and an abiding sense of fairness. Clarklebury functioned more like a military school than a teacher training college. The slightest infractions were swiftly punished. In assemblies, Reverend Harris always wore a forbidding expression and was not given to levity of any kind. When he walked into a room, members of the staff, including white principals of the training and secondary schools, together with the black principal of the industrial school, rose to their feet. Among students, he was feared more than loved. But in the garden, I saw a different Reverend Harris. Working in Reverend Harris's garden had a double benefit. It planted in me a lifelong love of gardening and growing vegetables, and it helped me get to know the Reverend and his family, the first white family with whom I had ever been on intimate terms. In that way, I saw that Reverend Harris had a public face and a private manner that were quite different from one another. Behind the Reverend's mask of severity was a gentle, broad-minded individual who believed fervently in the importance of educating young African men. Often, I found him lost in thought in his garden. I did not disturb him and rarely talked to him, but as an example of a man unselfishly devoted to a good cause, Reverend Harris was an important model for me. His wife was as talkative as he was taciturn. She was a lovely woman and she would often come into the garden to chat with me. I cannot for the life of me remember what we talked about, but I can still taste the delicious warm scones that she brought out to me in the afternoons. After my slow and undistinguished start, I managed to get the hang of things, and accelerated my program, completing the junior certificate in 2 years instead of the usual 3. I developed the reputation of having a fine memory, but in fact, I was simply a diligent worker. When I left Clarkbury, I lost track of Madhana. She was a day scholar, and her parents did not have the means to send her for further education. She was an extraordinarily clever and gifted person, whose potential was limited because of her family's meager resources. This was an all too typical South African story. It was not lack of ability that limited my people, but lack of opportunity. My time at Clarkbury broadened my horizons, yet I would not say that I was an entirely open-minded, unprejudiced young man when I left. I had met students from all over the Transkei, as well as a few from Johannesburg and Basutoland, as Lesotho was then known, some of whom were sophisticated and cosmopolitan in ways that made me feel provincial. Though I am